Welcome, boys and girls. Christine here with a discussion about Lord of the Rings Total War, which is something people have been demanding for Creative Assembly for, I think, over 20 years at this point. I certainly remember discussions on Total War Center well over a decade ago. Really, ever since Rome 1 came out, people have been asking Creative Assembly to do a Lord of the Rings Total War game. But while it makes sense for Creative Assembly to do it from a gameplay standpoint, it would be almost impossible for them to actually pull it off. This is a deep rabbit hole that you have to go into in order to figure out why it's such a problem. Because Lord of the Rings, suffice to say, the history of licensed projects in the Lord of the Rings universe has been a nightmare for as long as Lord of the Rings has been a thing. And that's why I want to talk about. But first, let's talk about the simpler stuff, the gameplay. Now, it might seem very logical for Creative Assembly to do it. We've seen with the Warhammer games that they can handle a medieval fantasy setting. They can handle heroes, they can handle single entities, they can handle magic, they can handle flying. And if we look at Lord of the Rings, it just seems like a perfect fit. In fact, it's actually very surprising at this point that there is no Lord of the Rings mod for any of the Warhammer games, or maybe very small things. The most I've seen personally is like a Minas Tirith map, which is not even called Minas Tirith, because of the licensing issues that do arise with Lord of the Rings. But while the gameplay would certainly fit, Creative Assembly at the moment, as a company, is obviously focusing on games that work more like a live service, and they want to sell DLC. Now, I have my bones to pick with regards to their business model right now, certainly the pricing of DLC, but that is what they're doing right now. The problem is, when you look at Lord of the Rings, let's take a look at the most logical place where they'd start, the Third Age. Well, you have the following factions. You have Gondor, you have Rohan, you have Isengard, you have Mordor, as, let's say, the first four starring factions. Then you can talk about Harad, Rhûn, Mirkwood, elves in general, dwarves, Dale, goblins. Those would be the principal factions that they could do. Maybe they split Gondor in different sub-factions, same with Mordor, so more DLC, more characters, all that, like Dol Amroth, for instance, the Nazgul, different types of Nazgul and how they would play, Minas Morgul. Sure, there's potential there, but there is a limitation, at least with the Third Age, in how much content they'd be able to do. But there's still a fair amount of DLC to tackle over there, especially if they say start with the four big factions, so Isengard, Mordor, Rohan, and Gondor, and then expand the map, add new characters, and new factions to play. Fairly logical, fairly sensible. I would argue, from my view, that it would work best if Creative Assembly went tall as opposed to wide. So instead of just adding as many factions as they want to, focus on fewer factions, but really give them complexity. Make them play very different, focus on the storytelling, focus on the characters, focus on the setting. And obviously we can talk about the Fellowship of the Ring and their story involved in all of that. I think that could work in theory. Whether or not Creative Assembly would want to tackle the storytelling aspect of a Lord of the Rings game, that's a different discussion, but I think that is the best way it would work to really make it feel like a proper video game instead of just a better modding project, because we do have Third Age Total War. So that is one thing to mention on this subject. But the gameplay aspect and the campaign aspects of it, that's the easy part. There's reasons why Creative Assembly may not want to do it compared to, say, 40k or even House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones. But the real reason why it's almost impossible for them to make a Lord of the Rings game has to do with the licensing aspect of Lord of the Rings. And that's where you go down a deep, deep rabbit hole to understand just how insane the situation is for Lord of the Rings as an IP. If Creative Assembly wanted to do a Lord of the Rings Total War game, they'd first have to reach out to Warner Bros. And New Line Cinema to get the rights to the movies. If they don't get those rights, even if they do make a game with a different look to say Minas Tirith, they'd probably get sued by Warner Bros. For undermining Peter Jackson's films. Warner Bros. And New Line control the rights to those movies. However, this is the easiest aspect of all of it, but it's not enough, because Warner Bros. And New Line don't actually have the rights to give you a video game license. That's owned by Embracer Group. And Embracer Group would also want a cut of the pie. So Warner Bros. Would want a cut of the pie and creative oversight, so you're not undermining their movie, so to speak. Then Embracer has a very different vision of things, would also want creative oversight, and then a piece of the pie, as I've said. That's still the easier part of all of it, but you can start understanding how complicated and what a legal nightmare it would be. Imagine being the guy in charge of dealing with this, just a lawyer in charge of managing all of this, and let alone the project lead for this. You'd be praying every single day, hoping you're not pissing off one of these sides. But still, that's not even the heart of it. Because if you're going to do anything in Lord of the Rings without getting sued, you then have to deal with the Tolkien estate. And the Tolkien estate is not even its own side. It's multiple sides, multiple factions, if you will, within the Tolkien estate with very different perspectives. Some just want a huge pile of cash, some are purists, some are in between. But suffice to say, even getting the estate alone to agree to all of this would be its own nightmare. And that's just for the third age. We're not talking about the second age. We're not talking about the first stage. So you're dealing with Warner Bros., New Line, Embracer, and the estate all at once. At the same time, and you're having to deal with revenue splits with all of these entities. Every single bit of content, every faction, every lord, anyone that's playable, or not even playable, but just under the control of the AI, everything would probably have to be a negotiation. Games Workshop is very open on wanting people to do video games. These entities are not so open to it. They know how valuable Lord of the Rings is as an IP. The only reason we get mobile games is because these entities, which have ICBMs pointed at each other from a legal standpoint, just kind of let that slide as just easy money. But a big AAA title, that's a completely different discussion, and that would be involving a lot of legal wrangling between these groups. But we're not finished, because then you have Amazon. You might wonder about Amazon. Well, Amazon is focused on the second age, so that seems like, okay, we can just ignore Amazon, until you realize Elrond, Galadriel, Sauron himself are in Rings of Power. Pretty important to deal with Amazon as well. Maybe not on the same level as the Big Four or the Big Three, but still very important to at least throw Amazon a bone in order to have a smooth journey with this without lawsuits that would drag on for years and probably involve settlements that cost millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. That's one of the reasons Amazon paid so much money to be able to produce Rings of Power, because they were also dealing with the same damn thing. But now they are also part of this puzzle. And then finally, you would also have to deal with Games Workshop if you're Creative Assembly. Not because Games Workshop really owns a lot of Lord of the Rings, though they do have a license for tabletop in Lord of the Rings, but tabletop only. Thing is, if you're Creative Assembly and you have a decade-long relationship with Games Workshop on the subject of making video games, and you might be looking at doing, say, Age of Sigmar or Old World or, yes, 40K, then you probably want to keep them happy as well. So, ask yourself the question, which person is insane enough to want to deal with all of this at once for a Lord of the Rings video game? 20 years ago, I would have seen it. I think it would have been worth it, because that's when we had the peak popularity of Lord of the Rings. But nowadays, that's a very different discussion and a very different situation. So my perspective on all of this, what do you think makes more sense? For Grave Assembly to deal with all that I've just described, and just understand this is a simplified version, and if you start looking into the weeds and going down that rabbit hole even further than I have, it gets even worse than all of this. Makes you really wonder what kind of genie in a bottle the people who made Gollum had in order to pull that one off, because that's one thing. But even Gollum is not the same, because a Lord of the Rings game would have those locations, would have those characters. You can't just make a game, a Total War game focused on one character. You would want Aragorn, you would want Boromir, you would want those locations, you would want the storyline. And everyone has their own vision on that storyline and how things are handled, and everyone wants money. So yeah, sure, if Grave Assembly would have $300 million, they could do it. But I'm not quite sure Sega would give them that kind of money, even if they had it. And I'm not sure they actually do have it, just lying around to pay all these IP holders in order to do a Lord of the Rings game. That's my perspective on this. If you want to talk about something that would make a lot more sense for Grave Assembly, yes, House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones would work a lot easier. Just go to HBO and just go to George R. R. Martin and get those rights. A lot freaking easier. Doing this, it's a nightmare. Actually, I'm not sure nightmare is a strong enough word to describe the insanity that one would be dealing with. I've seen geopolitics that weren't this difficult. Oh, and just a final note on this. Warner Bros., Embracer, and the estate all hate each other. Well, hate might be a strong word, or maybe a too small word. Let's put it like that, because they have competing visions, they have competing interests on the subject. They all want Lord of the Rings to be in a certain way. And that's where it gets even worse. Try dealing with that situation at, all these interests at the same time. Madness. Pure madness. That's why I think it's almost impossible that we'll get a Lord of the Rings Total War game. I would like to see it happen. I think CA has proven they could do it, but the licensing situation is just a nightmare. And it's been that situation for decades. I would actually say it's gotten worse over time. Costin signing out.